But why this fixation with death? Well, in short, it's probably because most people think of it as an evil, something to be afraid of. Now, Epicurus believed that this fear or anxiety had a detrimental effect on our existence, and that if we thought about death properly, I'll try and keep this closer, we could assuage a lot of our fears or anxieties about death. And he tries to do this through a pretty simple argument. It's well known, it's pretty famous, it's very simple. I won't read these out. The shorthand is basically, look, there's absolutely no reason to fear death, because when death is present, you are not. When you're present, death is not. Therefore, there's nothing to fear. Now, Epicurus will concede that what Leonard Cohen famously calls the preliminaries before death might still be unpleasant. So it might still be the case that you could be suffering or having anxiety as a result of a disease that could possibly end your life. If that's the case, some people might say, well, maybe Epicurus' arguments aren't all that effective, since that's the bit that they're actually afraid of. Now, the Roman poet Lucretius was heavily influenced by Epicurus' work, and he thought he could improve or enhance it, and he comes up with what's sometimes called the asymmetry argument in a poem called On the Nature of Things. And the force of the argument hinges on the same basic intuition, that it's irrational to fear a time when one will quite literally not exist. So he also reminds us that at the same time, we don't fear the period of time before we were born, when we don't exist, and for the same reason we shouldn't really fear the period of time after we die, when again we won't exist. But there's an asymmetry in our attitudes towards those two states, and that this is irrational. Not only that, he further argues, since we'll be dead forever, we'll be dead for eternity, it doesn't really matter when you die. Sooner or later makes no difference, because you'll be dead for eternity. Now, philosophers have been reflecting on and responding to both of those arguments for thousands of years. However, there's one interesting response that I think is worth examining briefly. We find the response in a famous essay by a British philosopher called Bernard Williams on the notion of immortality. So he's going to sum it up as follows. He says that Lucretius argues that death is not a misfortune to the one who dies, because the dead person will not be alive to lament their loss. The fear of death, it is suggested, must necessarily be the fear of some experiences had when one is dead. But if death is annihilation, then there are no such experiences. In the Epicurean phrase, when death is there, we are not, and when we are there, death is not. So, death being annihilation, there is nothing to fear. Second argument addresses itself directly to the question of whether one dies earlier or later, and says that one will be the same time dead, however early or late one dies, and therefore one might as well die earlier as later. And from both arguments we can conclude death is nothing to us and does not matter at all. Death is never an evil in the sense not merely that there is no one for whom dying is an evil, but there is no time at which dying is an evil. Sooner or later it is all the same. Now, Williams thinks that the second of those arguments shows that there's something wrong with the first, because it seems to imply that suppose you could only be dead for a short period of time, then if you died later would be better. That implication makes sense then only on the supposition that what's wrong with dying consists in something undesirable about the condition of being dead, which is the part that's denied by the first argument. So Williams thinks that this points to something quite confused about the Epicurean arguments, namely that the oddness of the second argument can help us to focus a difficulty already implicit in the first. And what's essentially wrong is that if you compare two lives, a long one and a short one full of the goods and the benefits we associate with a happy life, then someone who loses their life at a much earlier stage, we feel that they've lost out on something, which means that their death itself then can be seen as a privation of sorts, as preventing us from having something that's worth having. Okay, so we might be forgiven then for thinking that immortality is the ideal scenario, that that's what we should be striving for. But the fact that one might never at any point want to die at that specific moment is different to wanting to be a creature that never dies. So Williams is going to argue that the reason that we don't want to be a creature that never dies is because immortality, if it were to be conceivable at all, would be something that would be impossible to endure because it would become tedious, it would become boring. And in his own roundabout way, he's going to argue that mortality is actually an important component in what makes life significant to us, what makes it matter to us in some ways. So I'm going to turn to one final but very important thinker, Martin Heidegger. Heidegger died 50 years ago this week. We just had a fairly major 3-day international conference on his work in Sussex, where we had over 80 speakers, so he's still a very important and influential thinker to this day. And for Heidegger, the human being is always directed toward the future. And death for Heidegger is the term that he uses to describe the way we live towards the future. We live for Heidegger as dying creatures. So it's the term he uses for the way we live. He thinks of death as an active process, something that we enact. We live towards our future non-existence, not as creatures with an unbounded future, but rather always oriented by the fact that we're constantly moving towards possibilities. And those possibilities themselves are oriented and arranged by the ultimate possibility, which sort of sits at the end of the arc of our imagined rainbow of life, at the edge of the horizon, which is our future impossibility, our death. And this is constitutive of how our lives and the world are that we're thrown into are meaningful and significant for us. So if you take ordinary examples from even around this room, it's full of equipment, desks, chairs, and so on. And even if you only see a partial part of an object, you don't see an undifferentiated blank part of an object. You see the corner of a desk. Part of what's happening there is you're making present to yourself aspects of the thing that aren't currently available. So there's this constant interplay of presence and absence. You might remember that it's a chair that was here the last time you were in the room. That there's a stain on the back of it that you can't currently see, that it will be a chair sat on by someone else, a chair that might be used for years and years to come within this auditorium. Now, some of the aspects or features of the equipment we're talking about involve their future possibilities, things that have not been actualized yet. Nevertheless, they're part of what it means to be, for example, the chair that I see, that reveals itself to me as chair. We see other pieces of equipment, all of which are there for something or other, computers, phones, laptops, and so on. They're all things that are there for the sake of something. They point to possible actions that we or others might undertake, and they retain the traces of things that we or others have already undertaken. So part of what it means for them to be the devices that they are is that they mean more than what we perceive about them at any given moment. And Heidegger thinks that philosophy has tended to ignore or suppress this aspect of our experience and treats everything as though it is constantly and statically present, including ourselves. And he wants to destabilize this kind of thinking, as showing us how we already always operate almost unconsciously with this constant sense and interplay of presence and absence in our everyday existence. So everything about our everyday existence has this futurity, this forward-looking directionality to it. And then momentarily, when we're confronted by the possibility of our own death, we suddenly see the manner in which the inevitability of that death sits as the ultimate possibility that's constantly pulling us out of the present, toward the future, toward our possibility, in such a way as to mean that we are being towards death. And that's what gives a sense of urgency and purpose to our lives. In fact, if we were the kinds of beings that live forever, we might not feel the same urgency. It's an important part of what gives life meaning. So we can see that Heidegger's interested in the notion of death, and it's very different to the traditional ways that the subject was broached. Death in Heidegger's sense is in fact a way to live. So he carefully distinguishes between death as an actuality or biological or actual death, and death as a possibility, that is, as a way for us to be, as dying creatures. And he suggests that our normal everyday way of dealing with death is to treat it as an actuality, that is, as something that has already happened to someone else and therefore doesn't affect us. In other words, it doesn't stand for us as our ultimate possibility. So for Heidegger then, dying is a way to live. He's not really talking about death itself or the moment of death, but the fact that the way we are, what it means for us to be is to be towards the future. And that future has a sense of being horizontally oriented by the fact that we may at any moment cease to be. So the human being, understood strictly as an anthropological or biological entity, can perish. But that's not what it means for us to be as human beings. Thank you.